Swann's Way, Combre 2, Part 3. In Search of Lost Time, Volume 1, by Marcel Proust. When, on our reaching the house, my aunt would send to ask us whether Madame Goupil had indeed arrived late for Mass, not one of us could inform her. Instead, we increased our anxiety by telling her that there was a painter at work in the church, copying the window of Gilbert the Bad. Franoise was at once dispatched to the grocer's, but returned empty-handed, owing to the absence of Théodore, whose dual profession as a cantor, with a part in the maintenance of the church and as a grocer's boy, gave him not only relations with all sections of society, but an encyclopedic knowledge of their affairs. My aunt would sigh. I wish it were time for Eulalie to come. She is really the only person who will be able to tell me. Eulalie was a limping, energetic, deaf spinster who had retired after the death of Madame de Bretonnier, with whom she had been in service from her childhood, and had then taken a room beside the church, from which she would incessantly emerge, either to attend some service or, when there was no service, to say a prayer by herself, or to give Théodore a hand. The rest of her time she spent in visiting sick persons, like my aunt Leonie, to whom she would relate everything that had occurred at Mass or Vespers. She was not above adding occasional pocket money to the little income provided her by the family of her old employers, by going from time to time to look after the curé's linen, or that of some other person of note in the clerical world of Combre. Above a mantle of black cloth, she wore a little white coif, similar to a nun's, and an infirmity of the skin had stained part of her cheeks and her crooked nose the bright pink colors of an impatience flower. Her visits were the one great distraction in the life of my aunt Leonie, who now saw hardly anyone else, except the curé. My aunt had gradually eliminated all the other visitors because they all committed the fatal error, in her eyes, of falling into one or other of the two categories of people she most detested. One group, the worse of the two, and the one of which she rid herself first, were those who advised her not to be so anxious about her health, and preached, even if only negatively, with no outward signs beyond an occasional disapproving silence or doubting smile, the subversive doctrine that a sharp walk in the sun and a good red beefsteak would do her more good. When she had had 2 dreadful sips of Vichy water on her stomach for 14 hours, than all her medicine bottles and her bed. The other category was composed of people who appeared to believe that she was more seriously ill than she thought. In fact, that she was as seriously ill as she said. And so, those whom she had allowed upstairs to her room, after some hesitation and at Franoise's urgent request, and who, in the course of their visit, had shown how unworthy they were of the honor that had been done them by venturing a timid, "Don't you think that if you were just to stir out a little on really fine days," or who, on the other hand, when she said to them, "I am very, very low. It's the end, dear friends," had replied, "Yes, when one has no strength left, still, you may last a while yet." Each party alike might be certain that her doors would never open to them again. And if Franoise was amused by the look of consternation on my aunt's face whenever she saw from her bed any of these people in the Rue du Esprit, who looked as if they were coming to see her, or heard her own doorbell ring, she would laugh far more heartily, as at a clever trick, at my aunt's devices, which never failed for having sent them away, and at their dejected look when they had to turn back without having seen her. And she would be filled with secret admiration for her mistress, whom she felt to be superior to all these other people, since she refused to see them. In short, my aunt stipulated, at one and the same time, that whoever came to see her must approve of her way of life, commiserate with her in her sufferings, and assure her of an ultimate recovery. In all this, Eulalie excelled. My aunt might say to her 20 times in a minute, "It's the end, my poor Eulalie." 20 times Eulalie would retort with, "Knowing your illness as you do, Madame Octave, you will live to be 100, as Madame Sazarin said to me only yesterday." One of Eulalie's most rooted beliefs, and one that the formidable number of corrections she had experienced had not sufficed to eradicate, was that Madame Sazarat's name was really Madame Sazarin. "I do not ask to live to 100, my aunt would say, for she preferred to have no definite limit fixed to the number of her days. And since Eulalie knew, as did no one else, how to distract my aunt without tiring her, her visits, which took place regularly every Sunday, unless something unforeseen prevented them, were for my aunt a pleasure, the prospect of which kept her on those days in a state of expectation, appetizing enough to begin with, but at once changing to the agony of a hunger too long unsatisfied, if Eulalie was late in coming. Too prolonged, the rapture of waiting for Eulalie became a torture, and my aunt would never cease from looking at the time, and yawning, and feeling weak. Eulalie's ring of the doorbell, if it sounded at the very end of the day, when she was no longer expecting it, would almost make her ill. For the fact was that on Sundays she thought of nothing else than this visit. And the moment that our lunch was ended, Franoise would become impatient for us to leave the dining room, so that she might go upstairs to occupy my aunt. But, especially from the day on which fine weather set in at Combre, the proud hour of noon, descending from the steeple of Saint-Hilaire, which it blazoned for a moment with the 12 florins of its sonorous crown, would have long echoed about our table, beside the holy bread, which too had come in after church in its familiar way, and we would still be found seated in front of our Arabian Nights plates, weighed down by the heat of the day, and even more by our heavy meal. For, to the permanent foundation of eggs, cutlets, potatoes, preserves, and little cakes, whose appearance on the table she no longer announced to us, Franoise would add whatever the labor of fields and orchards, the harvest of the tides, the luck of the markets, the kindness of neighbors, and her own genius might provide, and so effectively that our menu, like the quatrefoils that were carved on the porches of cathedrals in the 13th century, reflected to some extent the rhythm of the seasons and the incidents of life. A brill, because the fishwife had guaranteed its freshness. A turkey, because she had seen a beauty in the market at Rosanville-les-Pins. Cardoons with marrow, because she had never done them for us in that way before. A roast leg of mutton, because the fresh air made one hungry, and there would be plenty of time for it to settle down in the 7 hours before dinner. Spinach, by way of a change. Apricots, because they were still hard to get. Gooseberries, because in 2 weeks there would be none left. raspberries which M. Swann had brought especially, cherry, the first to come from the cherry tree in our garden, which had yielded none for the past 2 years, a cream cheese, of which in those days I was extremely fond, a frangipan, because she had ordered one the evening before, a brioche, because it was our turn to offer the holy bread. And when all these had been eaten, a work composed expressly for ourselves, but dedicated most particularly to my father, who had a fondness for such things, a chocolate cream, inspired in the mind, created by the hand of Franoise, would be laid before us, light and fleeting as an occasional piece of music, into which she had poured the whole of her talent. Anyone who refused to partake of it, saying, "No, thank you, I finished, I'm not hungry," would at once have been lowered to the level of those barbarians who, when an artist makes them a present of one of his works, examine its weight and material, whereas what is of value is the creator's intention and his signature. To have left even the tiniest morsel in the dish would have shown as much discourtesy as to rise and leave a concert hall while the piece was still being played and right under the composer's nose. At length, my mother would say to me, "Now, don't stay here all day. Go up to your room if you're too hot outside, but get a little fresh air first. Don't start reading immediately after your food." I would go and sit down beside the pump and its trough, ornamented here and there like a Gothic font with a salamander, which modelled on the background of crumbling stone the quick relief of its slender allegorical body, on the bench without a back, in the shade of a lilac tree, in that little corner of the garden that communicated by a service store with the Rue du Saint-Esprit, and from whose neglected soil rose in 2 stages an outcrop from the house itself, and apparently a separate building, my aunt's back kitchen. One could see its red-tiled floor gleaming like porphyry. It seemed not so much the cave of Franoise as a little temple of Venus. It would be overflowing with the offerings of the milkman, the fruit merchant, the greengrocer, come sometimes from distant villages to dedicate to her the first fruits of their fields. And its peak was always crowned by the cooing of a dove. In earlier days, I would not have lingered in the sacred grove that surrounded the back kitchen, for before going upstairs to read, I would enter the little sitting room that my Uncle Adolphe, a brother of my grandfather and an old soldier who had retired from the service as a major, used to occupy on the ground floor. A room that even when its open windows let in the heat, if not the rays of the sun, which seldom penetrated so far, would never fail to emit the vague and yet fresh odor, suggesting both a forest and the era of the Ancient Regime, which sets the nostrils dreaming when one goes into an abandoned hunting lodge. But for some years now, I had not gone into my Uncle Adolphe's room, since he no longer came to Combre on account of a quarrel that had arisen between him and my family, by my fault, and in the following circumstances. Once or twice every month in Paris, I used to be sent to pay him a visit, as he was finishing his lunch, wearing a simple jacket and waited on by his servant in a work jacket of purple and white striped linen drill. He would complain that I had not been to see him for a long time, that he was being neglected. He would offer me a marzipan or a tangerine, and we would cross a room in which no one ever sat, whose fire was never lighted, whose walls were decorated with gilded mouldings, its ceiling painted blue in imitation of the sky, and its furniture upholstered in satin, as at my grandparents', only yellow. Then we would enter what he would call his study, a room whose walls were hung with prints which showed against a dark background a plump and rosy goddess driving a chariot, or standing on a globe, or wearing a star on her brow, pictures that were popular under the Second Empire because there was thought to be something about them that suggested Pompeii, which were later generally despised, and which now people are beginning to like again for one single and consistent reason, despite any others that they may advance, namely, that they suggest the Second Empire. I would stay with my uncle, and his valet came, with a message from the coachman to ask him at what time he would like his carriage. My uncle would then be lost in meditation, while his astonished servant stood there, not daring to disturb him by the least movement, wondering and waiting for his answer, which never varied. For in the end, after prolonged hesitation, my uncle would utter infallibly these words, "2:15, which the servant would echo with amazement, but without disputing them. 2:15? Very good, sir. I will go and tell him." At this date, I was a lover of the theatre, a platonic lover, since my parents had not yet allowed me to enter one, and so incorrect was the picture I drew for myself of the pleasures to be enjoyed there, that I almost believed that each of the spectators looked, as into a stereoscope, at a stage and scenery that existed for himself alone, though closely resembling the 1,000 other spectacles presented to the rest of the audience individually. Every morning I would hasten to the Morris column to see what new plays it announced. Nothing could be more impartial or happier than the dreams with which these announcements filled my mind. Dreams that took their form from the inevitable association of the words forming the title of the play, and also from the color of the playbills, still damp and wrinkled with paste, on which these words stood out. Nothing, unless it were strange titles such as The Testament de César Girondeau or Édipe Roi, inscribed not on the green bills of the Opera Comique, but on the wine-colored bills of the Comédie Française. Nothing seemed to me to differ more profoundly from the sparkling white plume of the Diamants de la Couronne than the sleek, mysterious satin of the Domino Noir. And since my parents had told me that, for my first visit to the theatre, I would have to choose between these two plays, I would study exhaustively, and in turn the title of one and the title of the other. For those were all I knew of either, attempting to snatch from each a foretaste of the pleasure that it offered me, and to compare this pleasure with the latent in the other title. Until, in the end, I had shown myself such vivid, such compelling pictures of, on the one hand, a play of dazzling arrogance, and on the other, a soft, velvety play, that I was as little capable of deciding my preference as if for dessert. I had to choose between riz à la impératrice and the famous chocolate cream. All my conversations with my playmates bore upon actors, whose art, although as yet I had no experience of, was the first of all its forms in which art itself allowed me to anticipate its enjoyment. Between one actor's tricks of intonation and inflection and another's, the most trifling differences would strike me as being of incalculable importance. And from what I had been told of them, I would arrange them in the order of their talent in lists that I used to murmur to myself all day long, lists that in the end became hardened in my brain and hampered it by their immovability. And later in my school days, whenever I ventured in class, when the teacher's head was turned, to communicate with some new friend, I would always begin by asking him whether he had begun yet to go to theatres. And if he agreed that our greatest actor was undoubtedly Got, our second Delaunay, and so on, and if in his judgment Febvre came below Thiron or Delaunay below Coquelin, the sudden volatility that the name of Coquelin, forsaking its stony rigidity, would engender in my mind, in which it moved upward to the second place, the miraculous agility, the rich vitality which with the name of Delaunay would suddenly be furnished, to enable it to slip down to fourth, would stimulate and fertilize my brain with a sense of budding and blossoming life. But if the thought of actors weighed so on me, if the sight of Maubant coming out one afternoon from the Théâtre Français had plunged me in the throes and sufferings of love, how much more did the name of a star blazing outside the doors of a theatre, how much more seen through the window of a brougham that passed me in the street, the hair over forehead abloom with roses, did the face of a woman who, I would think, was perhaps an actress, leave me with a lasting disturbance, a futile and painful effort to form a picture of her private life. I classified, in order of talent, the most illustrious: Sarah Bernhardt, Burma, Barthé, Madeleine Brohan, Jean Samary, but I was interested in them all. Now, my uncle knew many of them personally, and also courtesans not clearly distinguished from actresses in my mind. He used to entertain them at his house, and if we went to see him on certain days only, that was because on the other days women might come whom his family could not very well have met. So we at least thought. As for my uncle, his excessive eagerness to pay pretty widows who had perhaps never been married, and countesses whose high-sounding titles were probably no more than noms de guerres, the compliment of presenting them to my grandmother, or even of giving them some of our family jewels, had already caused him to quarrel more than once with my grandfather. Often, if the name of some actress was mentioned in conversation, I would hear my father say with a smile to my mother, "One of your uncle's friends." And I would think of the fruitless novitiate, through which, perhaps for years on end, men of real importance might have to pass, waiting on the doorstep of some such lady, while she refused to answer his letters and made her hall porter drive him away. And my uncle was able to dispense a youngster like myself from all these sufferings by introducing me in his home to the actress, unapproachable by so many others, but for him, an intimate friend. And so, on the pretext that some lesson, the hour of which had been altered, now came at such an awkward time that it had already more than once prevented me, and would continue to prevent me from seeing my uncle, one day, not one of the days that he set apart for our visits, I took advantage of the fact that my parents had had lunch earlier than usual. I slipped out, and instead of going to read the playbills on their column, for which purpose I was allowed to go out unaccompanied, I ran all the way to his house. I noticed before his door a carriage and pair with red carnations on the horse's blinders and in the coachman's buttonhole. As I climbed the staircase, I could hear laughter and a woman's voice, and as soon as I had rung, silence and the sound of shutting doors. When the valet opened the door and saw me, he appeared embarrassed, and said that my uncle was extremely busy and could probably not see me. He went in, however, to announce my arrival, and the same voice I had heard before said, "Oh, yes, do let him come in, just for a moment. It will be so amusing. In the photograph on your desk, isn't he the image of his mother, your niece, whose photograph is next to his? I would so like to see the little fellow, just for a second." I could hear my uncle grumbling and growing angry. Finally, the valet would tell me to come in. On the table was the same plate of marzipans that was always there. My uncle wore the same jacket as on other days, but opposite to him, in a pink silk dress with a great necklace of pearls about her throat, sat a young woman who was just finishing a tangerine. My uncertainty whether I ought to address her as Madame or Mademoiselle made me blush, and not daring to look too much in her direction, in case I would be obliged to speak to her, I hurried across to embrace my uncle. She looked at me and smiled. My uncle said, "My nephew," without telling her my name or telling me hers, doubtless because since his difficulties with my grandfather, he had endeavored as far as possible to avoid any association of his family with this other class of acquaintance. "How like his mother he is," she said. "But you've never seen my niece except in photographs," my uncle broke in quickly, with a note of anger. "I beg your pardon, dear friend. I passed her on the staircase last year, when you were so ill. It is true, I only saw her for a moment, and your staircase is rather dark, but I saw her well enough to admire her. This young gentleman has her beautiful eyes, and also this," she went on, tracing a line with one finger across the lower part of her forehead. "Is your niece's name the same as yours?" she asked my uncle. "He takes most after his father," muttered my uncle, who was no more anxious to effect an introduction by proxy in repeating Mamma's name aloud than to bring the two together in the flesh. "He's his father all over, and also like my poor mother." "I do not know his father," said the lady in pink, bowing her head slightly. "And I never saw your poor mother. You will remember, it was just after your great sorrow that we got to know each other." I felt somewhat disillusioned, for this young lady was in no way different from many other pretty women whom I had seen from time to time at home, especially the daughter of one of our cousins, to whose house I went every New Year's Day. Only better dressed. Otherwise, my uncle's friend had the same quick and kindly glance, the same frank and friendly manner. I could find no trace in her of the theatrical appearance that I admired in photographs of actresses, nothing of the diabolical expression that would have been in keeping with the life that she must lead. I had difficulty in believing that she was a courtesan, and I never would have believed her one of the chic courtesans had I not seen the carriage and pair, the pink dress, the pearl necklace. Had I not been aware, too, that my uncle knew only the very best of them. But I asked myself how the millionaire who gave her the carriage and her house and her jewels could find any pleasure in flinging his money away on a woman who had so simple and respectable an appearance. And yet, when I thought of what her life must be like, its immorality disturbed me more, perhaps than if it had stood before me in some concrete and special form. By being thus invisible like the secret of some novel, of some scandal that had driven her out of the home of her middle-class parents, and made her available to everyone, which had brought her to the bloom of her beauty, and raised to the demi-monde and to notoriety this woman, the play of whose features, the intonation of whose voice, like so many others I already knew, made me regard her, in spite of myself, as a young lady from a good family, even though she was no longer from a family at all. We had gone into the study, and my uncle, who seemed a trifle embarrassed by my presence, offered her a cigarette. "No, thank you, my dear friend," she said. "You know I only smoke the ones the Grand Duke sends me. I tell him that they make you jealous." and she drew from a case cigarettes covered with inscriptions in gold in a foreign language. "Why, yes," she began again suddenly. "Of course, I must have met this young man's father here. Isn't he your nephew? How could I have forgotten? He was so nice, so charming to me," she went on, modestly and with feeling. But when I thought to myself what must actually have been the rude greeting that she made out to have been so charming, I, who knew my father's coldness and reserve, was shocked, as though at some indelicacy on his part, at the contrast between the excessive recognition bestowed on him and his insufficient amiability. It had since struck me as one of the most touching aspects of the part played in life by these idle, studious women, that they devote their generosity, their talent, their transferable dream of sentimental beauty. For like artists, they never seek to realize the value of their dream, or to enclose them in the four-square frame of everyday life, and their goal that costs them little, to enrich with a fine and precious setting the rough and ill-polished lives of men. And just as this one filled the smoking room, where my uncle was entertaining her in his simple jacket, with her charming person, her dress of pink silk, her pearls, and the refinement suggested by intimacy with a Grand Duke, so in the same way she had taken some casual remark by my father, had worked it up delicately, given it a turn, a precious title, set it in the gem of a glance from her own eyes, a gem of the first water, blended of humility and gratitude, and so had given it back transformed into a jewel, a work of art, into something altogether charming. "Come now, it is time you went away," my uncle said to me. I rose. I could scarcely resist a desire to kiss the hand of the lady in pink, but I felt that to do so would require as much audacity as a forcible abduction of her. My heart pounded while I said to myself, shall I do it? Shall I not? And then I ceased to ask myself what I ought to do, so as at least to do something. Blindly, madly, flinging aside all the reason I had just found to support such action, I seized and raised to my lips the hand she held out to me. "Isn't he delicious? Quite a ladies' man already. He takes after his uncle. He'll be a perfect gentleman," she went on, clenching her teeth so as to give the word a slight British accent. "Couldn't he come to see me some day for a cup of tea? As our neighbors the English say, he need only send me a bleu in the morning." I had not the least idea of what a blue might be. I did not understand half the words the lady used, but my fear that there might be concealed in them some question that it would be impolite of me not to answer kept me from withdrawing my close attention from them, and I was beginning to feel extremely tired. No, it is impossible," said my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. "He is kept busy at home all day. He has plenty of work to do. He brings back all the prizes from his school," he added in a lower tone, so I wouldn't hear this falsehood and interrupt with a contradiction. "Who can say? He may turn out to be a little Victor Hugo, a kind of volabelle, don't you know?" "I adore artists," replied the lady in pink. "They alone understand women. They, and really superior men like you. But please, forgive my ignorance, my friend. Who is Volabelle? Is it those gilt books in the little glass case in your drawing room? You know, you promised to lend them to me. I will take great care of them." My uncle, who hated lending people books, said nothing, and ushered me out into the hallway. Madly in love with the lady in pink, I covered my uncle's old tobacco-stained cheeks with passionate kisses. And while he, awkwardly enough, gave me to understand without daring to tell me openly that he would rather I did not tell my parents about this visit, I assured him with tears in my eyes that his kindness had made me so strong an impression that some day I would most certainly find a way of expressing my gratitude. So strong an impression had it made on me that 2 hours later, after a string of mysterious utterances that did not strike me as giving my parents a sufficiently clear idea of the new importance with which I had been invested, I found it simpler to let them have a full account, omitting no detail of the visit I had paid that afternoon. In doing this, I had no thought of causing my uncle any unpleasantness. How could I have thought such a thing, since I did not wish it? And I could not suppose that my parents would see any harm in a visit in which I myself saw none. Every day of our lives, does not some friend or other ask us to make his apologies without fail to some woman to whom he has been prevented from writing? And do we not forget to do so, feeling that this woman cannot attach much importance to a silence that has none for ourselves? I imagined, like everyone else, that the brains of other people were lifeless and submissive receptacles, with no power of specific reason to any stimulus that might be applied to them. And I had not the least doubt that when I deposited in the minds of my parents the news of the acquaintance I had made at my uncle's, I would at the same time transmit to them the kindly judgment I myself had based on the introduction. Unfortunately, my parents had recourse to principles entirely different from those that I suggested they should adopt when they came to form their estimate of my uncle's conduct. My father and grandfather had words with him of a violent order. I learned from this indirectly. A few days later, passing my uncle in the street as he drove by in an open carriage, I felt at once all the grief, the gratitude, the remorse that I would have liked to convey to him. Beside the immensity of these emotions, I considered that merely to raise my hat to him would be petty and might make him think that I regarded myself as bound to show him no more than the commonest form of courtesy. I decided to abstain from so inadequate a gesture and turned my head away. My uncle thought that in doing so, I was obeying my parents' orders. He never forgave them. And though he did not die until many years later, not one of us ever set eyes on him again. And so, I no longer used to go into Uncle Adolphe's little sitting room, now kept shut. Instead, after hanging around the back kitchen until Franoise appeared on its threshold and announced, "I'm going to let the kitchen maid serve the coffee and take up the hot water. It is time I went off to Madame Octave," I would then decide to go indoors and would go straight upstairs to my room to read. The kitchen maid was an abstract personality, a permanent institution to which an invariable set of attributes assured a sort of continuity and identity throughout the long series of transitory human shapes in which that personality was incarnate, for we never found the same girl there 2 years running. In the year in which we ate such quantities of asparagus, the kitchen maid whose duty it was to pluck them was a poor, sickly creature, whose pregnancy was already far advanced when we arrived at Combre for Easter. And we were indeed surprised that Franoise allowed her to run so many errands in the town and to do so much work in the house, for she was beginning to find it difficult to bear before her the mysterious basket, fuller and larger each day, whose splendid outline could be detected through the folds of her ample smocks. These last recall the robes in which Giotto's cloaks some of the allegorical figures in his paintings, of which M. Swann had given me photographs. He it was who pointed out the resemblance, and when he inquired after the kitchen maid, he would say, "Well, how goes it with Giotto's charity?" And indeed, the poor girl, whose pregnancy had fattened every part of her, even her face, and the vertical squared outlines of her cheeks did distinctly suggest those virgins so strong and mannish as to seem matrons rather, in whom the virtues are personified in the Arena Chapel. And I can see now that those virtues and vices of Padua resembled her in another respect as well, for just as the figure of this girl had been enlarged by the additional symbol that she carried in her belly, without appearing to understand what it meant, without any rendering in her facial expression of all its beauty and essence, but carried as if it were an ordinary and heavy burden, so it is without any apparent suspicion of what she is about that the powerfully built housewife who is portrayed in the Arena beneath the label Caritas, and a reproduction of whose portrait hung on the wall of my schoolroom at Combre, incarnates that virtue. For it seems impossible that any thought of charity can ever have been found expression in her vulgar and energetic face. By a fine stroke of the painter's invention, she is trampling all the treasures of the earth at her feet, exactly as if she were crushing grapes with her feet to extract their juice, or still more, as if she had climbed on a heap of sacks to raise herself higher. And she is holding out her flaming heart to God, or better yet, she is handing it to him, exactly as a cook might hand up a corkscrew through the skylight of her basement kitchen to someone who would call down to ask her for it from the ground-level window. Envy, too, should have had some look on her face of envy, but in this fresco, too, the symbol occupies so large a place that, and it is represented with such realism, the serpent hissing between the lips of envy is so huge and so completely fills her wide-opened mouth that the muscles of her face are strained in order to contain it, like a child's who is filling a balloon with his breath. And envy's attention, and ours as well when we look at her, concentrated entirely on the action of her lips, had scarcely any time to spare for envious thoughts. In spite of all the admiration that M. Swann professed for these figures of Giotto, it was a long time before I could find any pleasure in seeing in our schoolroom, where the copies he had brought me were hung, that charity, devoid of charity, that envy, who looked like nothing so much as a plate in some medical book, illustrating the compression of the glottis or uvula by a tumor in the tongue, or by the introduction of the operator's instrument, a justice whose grayish and meanly regular features were the very same as those that adorned the faces of certain pretty and pious and slightly withered ladies of Combray, whom I used to see at Mass, some of whom had long been enrolled in the reserve forces of injustice. But in later years, I understood that the arresting strangeness, the strange beauty of these frescoes lay in great part played in each of them by its symbols. While the fact that these were depicted not as symbols for the thought symbolized was nowhere expressed, but as real things, actually felt or materially handled, added something more precise and more literal to their meaning, something more concrete and more striking to the lesson they imparted. And even in case of the poor kitchen maid, was not our attention incessantly drawn to her belly by the load that stretched it? And in the same way, again, are not the thoughts of men and women in the agony of death often turned toward the practical, painful, obscure, visceral aspect, toward that seamy side of death which is precisely the side that death actually presents to them and forces them to feel so cruelly, a side which far more closely resembles a crushing burden, a difficulty in breathing, a need to drink, than what we call the idea of death. There must have been a strong element of reality in those virtues and vices of Padua, since they appear to me to be as much alive as the pregnant servant girl, while she herself appeared scarcely less allegorical than they. And quite possibly, This lack, or seeming lack of participation, by the soul of a person in the virtue that is acting through him, has, apart from its aesthetic meaning, a reality that, if not strictly psychological, may at least be called physiognomic. Later on, when in the course of my life I have had occasion to meet with, in convents for instance, literally saintly examples of practical charity, they have generally had the brisk, decided, undisturbed, and slightly brutal air of a busy surgeon, the face in which one can discern no commiseration, no tenderness at the sight of suffering humanity, and no fear of hurting it, the face devoid of gentleness or sympathy, the sublime face of true goodness. Then, while the kitchen maid, who all unawares made the superior qualities of Franoise shine with added lustre, just as error, by force of contrast, enhances the triumph of truth, took in coffee which, according to Mamma, was nothing more than hot water, and then carried up to our rooms hot water that was barely tepid, I would be lying stretched out on my bed, a book in my hand, in my room which trembled with the effort to defend its frail, transparent coolness against the afternoon sun. Behind its almost closed shutters, through which, however, a reflection of the sunlight had contrived to slip in on its golden wings, remaining motionless between glass and woodwork, in a corner like a butterfly poised on a flower. It was hardly light enough for me to read, and the sensation of the day's splendor was given me solely by the blows struck down below, in the Rue de la Curée, by Camus, whom Françoise had assured that my aunt was not resting, and that he might therefore make a noise, on some dusty old packing cases, but which, reverberating in the sonorous atmosphere that accompanies hot weather, seemed to scatter aloft bright red stars, and by the flies who performed before me, in their small concert, as it might be the chamber music of summer, evoking heat and light, quite differently from an air of human music, which, heard by chance during a fine summer, will always bring that summer back to your mind. The flies' music is bound to the season by a closer, a more vital tie, born of sunny days and reborn only with them, containing something of their essence. It not merely calls up their image in our memory, but confirms their return, their tangible, ambient presence, immediately accessible. This dim coolness of my room was to the broad daylight of the street what the shadow is to the sunbeam, that is to say, equally luminous, and offered my imagination the entire spectacle of summer, which my senses, if I had been out walking, could have enjoyed in fragments only. And so it was quite in harmony with my state of repose, which, thanks to the adventures related in my books which had just excited it, sustained like a hand reposing motionless in a stream of running water, the shock and animation of a torrent of activity.